Okay, welcome back to Bricks at Home. We now have a presentation by Dan from Brick to the Past about building historical Lego models or reimagining history with little plastic bricks. So over to you, Dan.
Thanks very much, Richard. Hello, everybody, and thank you for attending. I've got this presentation, and I have to be honest, I haven't tested how long it is yet, and I noticed it was at 50 slides when I opened it this morning. So I've tried to do a bit of editing, but if I go through things a little bit quickly, it's only because I want to try and get through it. What I'm going to do, and I appreciate a lot of you have seen my stuff and the stuff that I build with the Brick to the Past guys anyway, but I'm going to go through how we go through a process of making our models. So how we do a bit of research, how we come up with the ideas, and then how it all comes together. But first of all, I just thought for those who know who we are, so Brick to the Past, we're basically a group of us who kind of met over the internet and through shows and things like that, who build really big historically themed Lego models. And we try and do a Lego model every year, although this year we're not because of obvious reasons. But we try and cover sort of something different, different time periods, and kind of like different subject matters, so it doesn't get too samey as well. And also because it's interesting to us to set ourselves kind of new challenges. And sometimes we try and fit in with a kind of a zeitgeist that might be going on. You know, if something's hit the news or something's popular in a particular year, we might look to try and feed into that. So I just wanted to like give you a bit of an intro to me. For me, this is where it all began with this this King's Keep castle, I think it was, which I think I got when I was about 9 or 10 or whenever that came out. And this is what kind of really got me interested in Lego. Not so much history, because I've always been interested in that, even at a young age. But obviously, as a teenager, I put my Lego bricks down and sort of got interested in other things. And it wasn't until I was sort of in my late 20s that I discovered this little minifigure, the Series 11 collectible mountain climber, that got me back into things. So actually, when I started out coming out of my dark age, as it was, I wasn't interested in building history at all. What I was interested in was taking this guy to crags and having him climb with me. But what happened is that I discovered the Roman soldier minifigure, and I've always been really interested in Romans. And to give you an idea of this kind of obsession that goes actually back to when I was a kid, my mother made me some cardboard Roman soldier armor, like the little guys here, and me and my brothers used to run around the garden throwing bamboo sticks at each other in a sort of mock Roman battles. So when I saw this minifigure, I was like, oh wow, I've got to do something. And then I started getting into Flickr and seeing what other people had done, and it was actually a model, and the models by James Pegram, who was another member of Brick to the Past, that kind of got me back into it. And based on these models I built here, I ended up joining Brick to the Past, and things kind of grew out of hand. And so now what I used to think these models here were quite big, now I'm building things of you know approximately 5 or 6 or 7 times bigger. So now going into Brick to the Past and what we do. I'm apologizing for this slide because this is going to be the most kind of work type slide you've ever seen in a Lego presentation, because what I'm using here is some pretty standard Word templates, but this essentially sets out the process of what Brick to the Past do. And I won't dwell on this too much, but the point is this is kind of like the structure of things that I'm going to talk around. So the first thing we essentially do is we look to see if there are any big anniversaries that we might want to build. And we essentially plan a year ahead. So for example, this year we're supposed to be celebrating the 400th anniversary of the voyage of the Mayflower. Obviously, we're not actually going to do that now. And last year we celebrated the 200th, or rather commemorated the 200th anniversary of the Peterloo Massacre. And then we kind of throw around ideas and try and come up with a draft plan. What I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on this model here, because this kind of encapsulates all the techniques that we use to come together to bring a model. So this is a model about the Jacobite risings, which we built in 2017. For those who don't know, this was a series of kind of rebellions in Scotland that were looking to put a Stuart back on the throne following the Glorious Revolution. And they took place roughly between, well, exactly actually between 1689 and 1746. And one of the reasons that I'm looking at this model is because there's actually several features that are based on real places. So Ruthven Barracks, for example, is a real place. It's a set of ruins. So is Cogarth Castle. The Battle of Killiecrankie is a real battle. And while our Highland township isn't based on anywhere, obviously, we had to try and to kind of bring that element in. And so what this has meant is that we were able to take a sort of kind of range of research techniques and ways of doing things and bring it all into creating this kind of one thing. And to a large extent, because I'm the only member of Bricks of the Past who built this model, who lives in Scotland, most of this fell to me. So I've got quite an intimate knowledge of the process that went on here, whereas in other models, other people have kind of taken the lead. So this is kind of the brainstorming stage, and this is the very first thing we tend to do. And this was drawn. This is like an initial plan of our model, which was drawn at about 8 o'clock at night in a pub. Most of the time, we don't try and do it in the pub. We actually tend to do it at the end of the Great Western Brick Show, which is like kind of the last time in the year we tend to all to be together. But this kind of plan was done without literally no research, just based on general knowledge and kind of throwing around some ideas of what we could do. And actually, in the end, our model didn't diverge too far from this, although we did choose to mix a few things around, and we kind of learned a few things that were wrong with this plan. And this is what the plan ended up looking like in the end, and kind of a division of work that went on between us. So I have no idea. We kind of estimated that there were a few million bricks in here, but I'm not, or rather pieces, but I'm not entirely sure. It's certainly the highest model that we've ever built, coming in at about 1 meter in height for the mountains. But I'll come on to that in a minute. So I was going to take Ruthven Barracks as an example of how lots of different pieces of research come together to produce a model. So Ruthven Barracks, it was a kind of government barracks built in the 1720s. Its ruins still exist. It's about half an hour from my house. So what that meant is that I could basically take site visits. And site visits, we'd actually try do quite a lot. So when we built the Hadrian's Wall model, we visited Hadrian's Wall. When we did the Peterloo Massacre last year, we obviously took advantage of being in Bricktastic the year before to have a walk of the city centre and actually pick out the features and the road patterns that are still there. And so in this instance, I was just able to basically go to the barracks to have a look around. And this is useful partly because all these historical sites, if they're any good, will have decent interpretation, which means you can draw from that to build interiors, for example, and to figure out the building structure. But it also allows us to build in things that, or rather to pick out the details and enable us to build those into the actual model. So, for example, we can take the windows here as an example of that, and the musket holes and kind of features on the towers as examples of that. So if we were just doing this, for example, as an online exercise and looking at photographs online, these details would be missed. So that's one of the reasons that every time we build a model, we try to do it as somewhere that we can actually visit first. And that's just another photo of it. Fortunately for us, on this particular building as well, there we could actually access the site's plans, because this comes back to kind of like the internet trawl and look through academic material, because there is actually a research paper from the early 2000s about the site, which presents the original engineer's plans for the barracks. And this is great because what it means you can do is you can really you can work out the scale that you need to build out, and you can also pick out the shapes. So for example, you might not appreciate that the towers on either side have these weird slanty edges, which I didn't realize looking at the photographs when I first started doing research. So it's kind of this, and you don't necessarily see it on the ground either because it's quite subtle. So it's this kind of useful information that, if available, a plan like this can make. And we were also able to get plans for Cuggarth Castle, which was the other big building on the site as well, and build from that. Now, obviously, there is a problem here because when you're trying to build at scale, the Lego man is not a very good representation of the human body. So there are kind of tricks and compromises you need to make that building look like the building it does in real life, while also making it fit in with the minifigure scale. What we tend to do, and this tends to be kind of a for us anyway, a kind of trial and error type thing. So for example, obviously we work to a scale, and it's usually somewhere between 1 in 40 to 1 in 44, but you can't work that for basically the area and the height, which means you need to either adjust the area or adjust the height to get a kind of an accurate feel for the minifigure being in there. And so that's actually what we did there. Is it maintained its height, but the area was slightly compressed so that it didn't quite look so weird. The next part of that model I was going to talk about was the Highland township, because this takes on another kind of element of how we do things. But there are basically no original Highland townships left in their full form, which means that obviously there are no plans, and there were never any plans for these buildings anyway, because they were kind of built informally. And also, in terms of the archaeology, what you're looking at is basically a kind of series of mounds in the dirt and the earth, which isn't exactly very helpful when you're trying to work out how something is built. So what we have to do in these situations is actually rely on the interpretation of other kind of experts in the fields, which is fine. But obviously what you tend to find is that certain people will interpret things in different ways, and they might be equally valid, but you've got to choose a way of doing that, because they're not necessarily compatible. So for this model, however, we were quite lucky in that we were able to do another field trip, because there is the Highland Folk Museum. Again, this is not too far from where I live. Have built their own Highland township on their kind of open air museum, and they've done this using traditional techniques and based on archaeological evidence. So while it's not obviously a real village, it does give a really good sense of the sort of buildings and the building styles and the things that went on that we need to build. I learned quite a lot from this, because what they have is kind of reenactors at the site doing things like weaving or thatching, because there's always a level of maintenance that goes on, and you're able to then speak to these people who are experts in their field and find out what exactly the features you should be picking out are. Now, for us, one of the important things about the township was bringing it to life with kind of traditional activities that the minifigures should be doing. And this is actually a really important part of our model creation, because what we don't want is just a series of buildings and landscapes that are sterile, which might be fine buildings in themselves, but actually where you engage people in the history is in the way you use your minifigures. And what I always say is it's quite important when you're building a model like this to tell a story, and it doesn't have to be a complicated story. It can be just a couple of minifigures together, but it needs to be able to tell you something about the time that you're trying to represent. And that, I think, is one of the things that sets us apart from other kind of historical models. So in this scene, what we're showing is the traditional Highland activity of walking the cloth. And what that was, it was basically treating materials to create plaids. And essentially what the women of the village would do is they would basically they are dipping the material in urine to treat it. But at the time, what they do is in a group like this, and they would have specific songs that they would sing to a rhythm as they went around, and that's quite something that, at least in the part of Scotland that we're trying to create, is quite well known. So if you stick something like that in there, it immediately draws people who know about it to the model, and it's also something you can help them share and illustrate the kind of the history you're telling. Again, another thing that we fed in was peat cutting, because again, that was a very important part of life. It was where they got their fuel for the most part. So we added that in. And we also added in other kind of traditional activities. So this here represents shinty, which is as a Highland game, which I describe as an incredibly violent form of hockey, where you can swing the the stick above your head. And these days people wear pretty decent protective gear, but in the past they would have just whacked each other around the head with wooden sticks. So again, that was another thing that we wanted to show. I have to admit that some of the kind of ideas that we got from this don't necessarily come from kind of academic or historical material. So I don't know if anybody's familiar with the TV show Outlander, which is in its sixth season or something now. But the first two seasons are all set in the Highlands. And what they do very well, actually, is show some of these kind of scenes of everyday life, even though it's fit in with this kind of weird about time travel. So what we're able to do then is again kind of take ideas from that, do a bit more research, again talk to people who are involved in these activities and sports, and then fit them into the model. And I have to say, another quite good thing about that is people who watch the show recognize it, and it kind of helps promote the model in some ways. And so the final thing that we kind of built in this was cattle grazing, because this is one of the kind of main way that these people lived in terms of their subsistence farming. This is before sheep were released on the Highlands and before the clearances happened, and the people and the townships removed. So it's kind of really trying to show that kind of pre-clearance way of life there. Now, one of my favorite parts of any model is designing the minifigures. And for this, it's quite a kind of interesting process where you're bringing in lots of sources of information and material, and then trying to fit a minifigure design using the limitations that you have from Lego pieces into that. And so for this model, we designed two big armies. We designed a Jacobite army and a Redcoat army. And the Redcoat army is quite straightforward because it's like your Pirates of the Caribbean torsos and white legs. But the Jacobite army was something we've never done before. So in terms of research for this, and this applies actually for a lot of the models we build, we first do an internet trawl to see if there's any online images that are suitable. But actually what we find, especially for armies, is the best thing to do is to look at and see if there are Osprey books. So Osprey Publishing basically publish books about armies and soldiers and military equipment, and they have these. This is what the image on the right here is from, and they produce these really good, basically just paintings of kind of the typical soldiers from various regiments, showing their dress and equipment. So that was a really useful. So they're always really useful, and we looked at those for pretty much any model that has any kind of military aspect in. So for example, when we did the model in 2018 about buccaneers, we were able to take their books and use them to design our kind of our pirates. Another like tip I would say, if you are looking to build a historical army, is to actually look at wargaming books, so rule books for war games, because again, they're catered for people who are trying to basically paint little soldiers as detailed and as accurate as they possibly can. So they often, again, have really good information about what the equipment and the dress would have been like. And the other thing they do is they will tell you about what formations you should put your soldiers in and things like that. So again, they're a really good source of information. Now, for this model, we were also lucky enough to be able to visit a reenactment of a battle. And again, this is another really good source of kind of information that you can draw upon when army building, because battle reenactors are really enthusiastic. They're really keen to get their equipment and uniforms right, and they will have a wealth of knowledge about the sort of things you should be doing and showing. So again, this was at the Highland Folk Museum, who have this kind of event every year, where we were able to talk to people from Alan Breck's regiment, who are the Redcoats on the left, and I think it's the Earl of Buchet's Highlanders or something like that, who play the Jacobites. And again, this gave us an idea of kind of what they should be wearing essentially, and what their camps should look like. And then we banged that into a battle. Now, this is one of the areas where we kind of compromised in this model, because the Battle of Killiecrankie happened in 1689, but we were trying to depict events later than that, because that was the way we were going to fit more interesting features in the model. So while the geography of this site is based on Killiecrankie, the actual design of the soldiers is much later. It's looking at a kind of 1745, 1746 era. Again, this pretty much what demonstrates quite neatly one of the Highland Jacobite soldiers that we created, the typical musket, which would have been carried, and when they charged, they would have carried the musket with them, fired before getting to the government lines, dropped the musket, and then charged in with a sword and shield. In terms of the minifigure here, it's one of those collectible minifigure Highland torsos, but with a custom kilt added, which I think are by Capes for minifigs or something like that, who do a really good range of that kind of thing. And based on our kind of talk with the reenactors, we were able to add in some pretty specific units from the period. So these are Irish piquettes, who were basically French troops who were originally from Ireland, who were lent to the Jacobites to fight the British government. We were also able to fit in the Royal Écosse, who were again Scottish troops from France who were lent to fight the British government. And we also added in these represent the Manchester Regiment, who basically were recruited in Manchester when the Jacobites arrived there in 1745, and then moved back north with them when they retreated. Because one of the things you've got to appreciate, actually, when you see depictions of any army, there are assumptions made about it, about what they look, and what we try and do is break through those assumptions and actually do the research to find out actually what were the elements of it, because it wasn't just Highlanders, there were lots of lowlanders in there. And while there was an attempt for this army to kind of homogenize their look, they were basically like marching in their own clothes. So people from Manchester were not wearing kilts, for example. And on the redcoat side, again, we tried to fit in more than just your standard redcoat. So the guys in the golden hats represent grenadiers. The guys in the dark red at the top represent Hessian mercenaries who were recruited from Germany, because at the time it was George II at the time was obviously from Hanover, so he was German, so there was that link. And then we also have at the bottom right hand side there an example of the Scottish troops that were in the British Army, because again, this wasn't a Scotland versus England fight. In fact, it was mostly Scots on both sides. And what we're showing here is basically the Black Watch, who were a Highland regiment recruited in the 1720s to keep a control over the Highlands. And they were at various battles during the Jacobite Rebellion. And that's a close-up of them. It was quite fun designing these minifigures because they're distinctly different from the ones that you normally see. Again, returning to the kind of stories element of our models, the battle, you don't really know what's going on, so it's kind of set up in a typical formation of what a battle would have looked like. But what we do know about Killiecrankie, there was a particular story. Basically, the Jacobites won. They had a massive victory against the British government, and the British government fled down this gorge to get away. And there's a story of one British soldier who jumped across the gorge to get away from the fleeing, to get away from the pursuing Jacobites. And so that's what this represents here. And again, that again feeds into people's knowledge of it, and you're able to talk around various kind of interesting things as part of that story. Now, for this model, and actually, for this model, the landscape was particularly challenging, but we always trying to do a decent landscape in whatever model we make. Last year we did basically Manchester in 1819, so that was somewhat different, but most of the other models have a big landscape in it. And I have to say, this is probably the most challenging landscape we've ever built, and that challenge lay entirely on the shoulders of James Pegram, who built pretty much for a year, did nothing but build this mountain range. And I can tell you, because I helped him put it together, it's a delicate nightmare of a thing, with basically just lots of 1x1 bricks leaning against each other on 16x16 plates, and they all kind of slot in somehow. But actually, when it all comes together and it's like this, it's actually pretty solid, and you can put quite a lot of weight on it. Not that you'd let anyone do that too much. And anyway, he's never going to do anything like this again, because he hated it. But one of the things that we try and do is try and get an idea of what the area's landscape looked like. So this is a kind of stereotypical representation of the Scottish Highlands, I would say. But for me, kind of one of the key features was the river system. So we've got two different types of rivers. The one on the kind of left-hand side of the mountain is what you'd normally see, and the one on the right is pretty not typical, but certainly unique in a British sense, Highland River, which is a kind of braided river system. And there's again a very famous one of those just down the road from me. So again, this landscape here is based on a place called Glenfeshie. And in terms of the landscape, aside from the mountains, which are built on these 16x16 base plates, I'll come on to that in a minute. One of the important things about a landscape is to add life. So obviously trees, rocks, and as many animals as you can fit in. So I designed or a lot of the animals for this. I really like this deer, which is why I'm showing it. We have got instructions on our website to all the animals that we built for this model. Because again, that brings out, and if you're using kind of iconic species of an area, so for example, the Highlands, so we have this stag, again, it kind of brings out that sense of place, which is that tells you it's Scotland or wherever. Most of our landscape modules are built on 48x48 base plates like this, and then they just slot together at an event like so, which usually works okay. At this particular event, I forgot a 48, and so I had to send Simon home to bring some more Lego up to us. That's the only time that's happened, and that's the only time it ever will. But usually it comes together quite easily, where we just we've got the plan, we know where we fit them on the grid, and they just slide together. And actually, there's very little holding these 48 base plates together, because you don't need it, and they all just sit there for an event. Obviously, breaking it up makes it easier to transport, because you strip off the vegetation and you stack them on top of each other, and you drive them along in your car. What I favourite, obviously, what we're doing this for is to show it off at an event. This model went down really well. We had it in at Bricktastic, at Steam, and we also rented it out to Historic Scotland for 3 months, where it was at Stirling Castle, and it went down really well. So what I quite like is getting good feedback, obviously over social media, and this is all great. But to be honest, my favorite thing is when we get in like a tabloid newspaper. And for this model, we ended up in a Daily Express, and people write stuff like this about us. We only ever get these comments from the Daily Express, which is interesting. So it tells you a lot about their readers. And I hope I don't offend anyone who's listening by saying that. But one of my favorite things is when people then are inspired by what we do, and then and in this case, this lady's go away and try and build something that we've done. So this here is a miniature model of a broch, which is a model that we built in 2016 for the Case Broch project. We created like mini instructions for a little broch, and basically this kid didn't have all the parts, so he's gone away and done his own thing, and it is really great. And that's my little talk done. So this is like a video of images that we took of this model, which I'm gonna leave up, but I will open it up for any questions if anyone has any.
Brilliant, thanks Dan, that was fantastic. Does anybody have any questions? Would you like to put them in chat if so? I can imagine there's some slow typing. Any questions? I think we may have had, here we go. How do you coordinate the contours of scenery with other people?
Oh, that's that's a good question. I would say, well, basically, what we do is whoever starts first sets the height at the edge. So it pays for us to start. Obviously, what we have an idea of where we want to get to at a particular point. So, but we don't always know exactly where we're going to be at the edge. So we basically share photographs. We used to do it over Flickr a lot and have private groups, but what we found actually these days is it's much easier to do over WhatsApp. So when you're building, you'll just WhatsApp a photo to whoever's building adjacent to you and say, look, this is the height along the edge, and then they've got what I have miscommunications, and there's like a plate, or in one case a brick difference between the different sections. So we kind of take a lot of spare landscape parts along with us to an event just to make sure that we can fill in those gaps if necessary. What I would say is bamboo stalks and bits of grass cover a multitude of sins.
They definitely do, yes. Yeah. I know that feeling well. We have quite a few more questions. So one question from Al is, do you have any tips for forming terrain and keeping it natural?
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult one to explain because a lot of the time you're kind of doing it on a kind of sense of what you feel looks right. So it's kind of like quite hard to explain that. But what I would say is you need to experience terrain to understand how it should look. So go for walks around, see what it looks like. And if you can't get to the place you're trying to recreate, look at as many photographs as you like. Then when you're coming into building it, basically you're trying to stay away from too many straight lines. You're trying to stay away from doing too many uniform changes in height. Now, initially what you might be doing is, because you're trying to create a structure on which a landscape can sit and be, crucially, will travel and not fall apart in transit, is you tend to create a grid which then you build upon, which is quite part intensive, and that's the way I work. I have to say James works slightly differently, he builds stuff that is incredibly brittle, but once you've got your grid, then you can start to add in the kind of details and what I would call a kind of process of dithering, which is kind of like just breaking up those straight lines. Yeah. If you're building a river, obviously make sure it looks like it's in a valley, and if it's got bends on it, think about how maybe the water might erode that. So on the outside of a bend, you can have erosion. So what I tend to do there is create a kind of like an in-cut into the landscape, and if on the outside of the bend on the inside of the bend you can often get a little beach or something like that. So again, that's something to kind of think about while you're building models. And then it's adding vegetation. And obviously, when you're building a model of this scale, you can't just stick grass in every studs. So it's a matter of then just placing it strategically. And I would say in clumps, because that, certainly in the terms of this model, represents kind of like your reeds and things like that, which do grow like that. It's never uniform. And it's kind of trying to keep that kind of sense of almost randomness to your landscape. I mean, it's not random, obviously, because you're trying to recreate natural landforms and processes, but it's kind of just, again, nature doesn't have straight lines, or at least it very rarely has straight lines. So stay away from that and you'll go along.
Great, thanks, Dan. One question from Frankie is, how do you find working in a team? Are there ever arguments?
There are never arguments. I'd say we've never argued, although it can be frustrating sometimes. It can be sometimes. We actually all live in different parts of the country. So I live in the Scottish Highlands. James lives pretty much the furthest place you could be from me, down near Exeter. Then we've got a few people in between. But I don't actually get to see anyone through the whole kind of build process. So WhatsApp really helps because you can have that level of quick communication. We also kind of do your Skype or Zoom meetings or whatever occasionally when it's needed. The key is communication, I would say, if you want to avoid any conflict or frustration. It's just trying to be in contact as much as possible. And if you've got a question, no matter how dumb you might think it be, just always ask it, because if there's a simple answer and you know exactly what that is, then it's good to get it.
Yep, I think I would agree with that. Do have some more. So Sylvia asks, how long have you been recreating history?
So I have been doing it since I came out of my dark age, basically. So that was in late 2013. But the other guys have been doing it a lot longer. So I don't think James, who built the mountain here, has ever had a dark age. I think he's just kept on building, and he showed me some photographs of some of his first kind of efforts as an adult from I think about 2008, which I don't think he'll mind me saying look horrible, but he's been going a lot longer than us. So I mean, probably about 60 odd years of experience in building historical Lego models.
Great. Somebody asked, although I'm having trouble finding it in the chat, they were asking where you source all of the Lego in bulk in such quantities.
Oh, I can't speak for the other guys because I don't know. But for myself, to be honest, it mostly comes from Bricklink and the the bricks and pieces thing on the Lego website. I don't have any special contacts or anything like that, I'm afraid.
Stuart asks, how was the hillside built? Was it built, I think you said something about it being 1 brick wide.
Yes, this is I'll try and explain it, but James built it, so he'd be able to tell you better. The vast majority, right, okay, is basically it's stacks of 1 by 1 bricks, and they are attached to hinge plates at the bottom, and then tipped at an angle. So there may be like in some places, I think a continuous line of about 100 bricks going up. So basically, there's just a lot, and there's slope in there as well, because obviously in certain places you need to create kind of a more rigid structure. But then all these bricks are then stacked upon or attached to 16 by 16 plates, and they kind of slot in more or less neatly. Again, I would say use your bamboo stalks to cover up those kind of kind of gaps and things like that. But then what we found, like in a mountain, it doesn't actually have to be perfect, and having cracks and things like that is what a mountain has. So again, coming back to the sort of landscape question, don't get too precious about where your joins are and things like that. It doesn't matter. You can have gaps, and your pieces don't have to fit together neatly. And if you're using snot techniques, don't worry about the fact that there's some weird geometries in certain bricks. It's fine. It looks better if you create it like and have those faults.
Yep, I would agree. Another Stuart has asked, did you start the Mayflower project? Will it come back next year, or are you contemplating something new for 2021?
So in terms of the Mayflower project, we've already built part of it, so we're definitely going to bring it to 2021.
Excellent.
It's just that essentially we're not continue building it this year because I don't have room to store a model of that size for that length of time. Ties up my Lego.
A fair point. Kirsten asks, given unlimited time, bricks and space, which follows on neatly from the last answer, is there a historical model you'd really love to build?
I've got a few if it was unlimited. I'm sure most of you have seen Rocco's kind of miniature model of Rome. I would like to make a minifigure scale one of those. Or to think more locally, I'd love to build, say, Caernarfon Castle in Wales or Stirling Castle in Scotland, or something really big like that.
That would be really nice. Frankie has another question. How do you transport the 48 by 48 base plates? Because I find them a nightmare to transport to shows.
Yeah, they are a nightmare to transport to shows. And I don't have a very good system, to be honest. I've got some large boxes. I put the 48s in there, then I stack bubble wrap around them, and then just pile the 48s up. So which is why I try to build them quite solidly, because they would otherwise fall apart. I know some other guys have actually built custom boxes for theirs, which basically it's like a kind of made out of kind of the box material that you get for music equipment and things like that, and they just slot their 48s into them. And I'm quite jealous of that because I don't really have the skills to build those. But
I have. Sorry, Dan.
I was going to say bubble wrap is my thing.
Bubble wrap, yep. Bubble wrap and a bit of sellotape around them.
I've
seen some modelers have used bread crates to transport them, and if you get the right ones, you can get a set number of base plates into them quite comfortably, as long as and they're stackable as well. But I'd imagine they still need a bit of bubble wrap to insulate them against bumps in the road and things on the way to the show. Do we have any more questions for Dan? We've still got 5 minutes or so before we need to wind the session up, really. I think we've exhausted, well, possibly exhausted Dan and maybe exhausted the audience. That was really great. Some really cool shots of models there as well. Chris says it's really nice that the instructions for the animals are online as well. That's quite a cool thing to release, because building models that actually represent a specific animal at that scale, I think, is quite a challenge sometimes.
Yeah, it certainly is. Yeah, I can send around the link to that. That we've got it on the blog that we have on our website, if you like. I don't know if when you send out the video or whatever, so to be included.
Yeah, we can try and add it to the description. I think it's going to take a while to update them accurately, but we will get there eventually.
No worries.
Yep. So I think we can wind the session up and give Dan a virtual applause, which Dan probably won't hear because everybody's still muted at the moment. But thank you very much, Dan. That was fantastic.